We're moving on to look at the composition of armies between 1500 and 1700, which means what different parts there were in those armies. We've seen that in the Middle Ages, 1250 to 1500, as well as that also we'll look at tactics. The first point to make, obviously, is changes in the weapons that have largely led to changes in the composition of armies and changes in the tactics used by armies, as you'll see in this presentation. So if we look at the infantry first of all, armies typically 1500 to 1700, of course you still had the infantry, which still remained the biggest proportion of armies during this period. And infantrymen were composed of a combination of musketeers, in other words, soldiers, infantrymen with muskets, matchlock, flintlock muskets, and as well as musketeers, you would get pike men as well. It's important to note that the proportion of musketeers did increase steadily throughout this period, and we reached a point by 1700 that almost all infantrymen were armed with muskets. Of course, you also have the cavalry during this period, which typically made up about a third of the army, and cavalry would be armed with swords and pistols. They would no longer wear suits of armour. There was little point really. Suits of armour tended to limit your mobility on the battlefield, and as well as that also they're not going to offer you much protection against matchlock muskets and the lead shot that is fired out of the muzzles. So you would sometimes see cavalrymen wear just plate armour breastplates as well that would hopefully offer some protection against the sort of the big part of your body in battle. You've also got artillery, which is really the use of cannons on the battlefield. They're not a major part of armies during this period. We've discussed cannons before. They are still a developing weapon during this period, so there's very few artillery groups on the battlefield in armies during the period 1500 to 1700. And just also to introduce you into this period, one of the changes is you do get bands of dragoons in armies. They're a small proportion of the army, and they were mounted infantry. So they would be on horseback, they would be armed with muskets, they would ride into position, but then would dismount and would fight on foot. Very difficult to fire a matchlock musket from horseback because you need two hands to fire the musket. They had smaller horses, basic equipment. They're sort of a poor version of the cavalry really. They didn't wear armour, but they were cheap to recruit and to maintain, and that provides us with one of the reasons you do see dragoons being used during this period, sometimes in armies, but again, a small proportion of the army. So if we look at tactics really, we've just looked at composition of armies during this period. Changes in weaponry had an impact on the tactics used in battle during this period. And so during this period, one of the big tactical changes driven by the capabilities of the weapons used is the idea of deploying forces in squares. So for example, you would put your musketeers in squares, mostly to achieve continuous fire. And this was developed from the 1590s by Prince Maurice of Nassau from the Netherlands. Another example of an individual who influenced warfare during this period, and you're going to come across quite a few of this. The role of individuals is going to be another factor that is progressing, making change happen in warfare across these periods. And Prince Maurice of Nassau, his tactics became known as the Dutch countermarch, which you can see in a diagram actually on page 38 of your textbook on the left-hand side. And the Dutch countermarch is quite simply where musketeers were deployed in squares of about 6 rows. And how it worked was the front row would fire, then march to the back to reload, while the second row moved forward to fire, and so on and so on. And therefore you would get this continuous rate of fire whilst other soldiers reloaded. And you could move forwards at the same time too and advance on the enemy. Now, a variation of that tactic was developed by King Gustav Adolf of Sweden from the 1620s. And this was where Swedish armies deployed their musket squares in rows 6 deep. You can see a diagram of this at the bottom of page 39. This is the Swedish salvo, as it was called. And again, you've got another example through Gustav Adolf of an individual affecting and influencing tactics. And the Swedish salvo quite simply worked similarly to the Dutch countermarch. The first row of musketeers would kneel down, the second would crouch just above them, and the third row would stand. So that meant that the front 3 rows could fire all together and create obviously a very powerful, forceful volley of fire. These 3 rows would then withdraw to the back and would reload, while the remaining 3 rows would move forward, adopt those positions of kneeling, crouching and standing, and again would fire, and so on and so on. So squares tactically had several advantages really. The first one is that you could keep up a continuous rate of fire in spite of long reload times for muskets. So this is one of the ways in which the limitation actually of the weapon was tactically changed for the better on the battlefield. Obviously musketeers could fire and then reload while the other rows moved forward to fire. Secondly, musketeers increased their chances of hitting their target by firing as a group. You know, the accuracy of individual muskets wasn't that great, but if you fired many of them at the same time, then you've got a better chance of hitting targets. So again, it's another way in which tactics were born out of the inadequacies or the limitations of the musket weapon. 3, you would also get squares, sometimes of pikemen, that could defend an attack from any side. So almost like a version of the schiltron that you saw back in the Middle Ages there, the circular rings that were used by William Wallace as your best example at Falkirk. Now they are developed in squares, again for the very same reasons here. You could also have the push of the pike. So this is 4th. Pikemen could fight against other pikemen. They could use their combined weight to push against each other. So, for example, their combined weight in this so-called push of the pike, pikes were raised in the air, and the group, the square of pikemen, would push against the other pikemen, and eventually one group of pikemen would break formation and would be defeated. So this was one of the ways in which tactics were used with the pike in squares. Fifthly, squares of pikemen were usually placed on the battlefield between squares of musketeers. So pikemen could quickly move in front of the musketeers in order to protect them from cavalry or even a charge with pikes. So you can see that square formations had several advantages on the battlefield, and these new tactics were of course developed from the weaponry that was being used. Not just the strengths of the weaponry, but also the limitations of the weaponry as well. It's also important to note the role of individuals in developing these tactics in the form of Prince Maurice of Nassau and also Gustav Adolf of Sweden.